King's Cross Station, one of the busiest hubs in the heart of the London Underground. In November 1987, a fire started on one of the escalators. A tiny spark suddenly became a devastating inferno. The blaze ravaged the main concourse, claiming the lives of 31 people. It would take investigators months to work out what went wrong at King's Cross. The answer would finally emerge from a most unlikely source. The London Underground is the oldest subway system in the world. For nearly a century and a half, its lines and sprawling passageways have stretched across the city. In wartime, it doubled as an air raid shelter, a safe refuge from German air attacks for 200,000 Londoners. No one ever imagined that the Underground could become a death trap. Until the 18th of November, 1987. King's Cross is one of the biggest and busiest tube stations in London. 5 lines converge here, and every day, 250,000 people navigate its maze of tunnels and escalator shafts. It's the very centre of the Underground. At 7:27 on the evening of the 18th of November, Philip Squire stepped off a westbound Piccadilly line train at King's Cross. Late to meet a friend, he pushed his way through the crowd. He was alone on the escalator when he saw it.
There was smoke coming down over the steps towards my feet, and I just thought it was a cigarette that someone had dropped, and I remember being annoyed. So I looked a bit more carefully, and I realised there was a gap between the down part of the escalator and the next tread, which I could see through, and I could see some light in there.
The escalator at King's Cross, like many on the Underground at that time, was made of wood. Under the struts, a small fire was smouldering. At 7:29, 16 minutes before the deadly blast, Squire reached the concourse and spoke to a member of staff.
I said to the guy, "I've just come up the escalator over there. I think you've got a fire." And he just looked at me quizzically, and then he just picked up a telephone. And at that point, I went back to the top of the escalator to look down. The escalator was still moving, and more people were coming off. And rather than leaving the station, they were just standing around wondering what's happening.
Passengers seemed more curious than alarmed. They didn't see the fire.
And so I started to feel a bit uncomfortable because you couldn't see anything. There was no visible proof of what I'd seen.
Two minutes later, at 7:31, another passenger noticed something glowing under the escalator and pushed the emergency stop. Well-intentioned, but a big mistake. With the escalator moving, the fire couldn't spread to the wooden steps. But once stationary, they began to burn. By 7:33, flames were visible. Amazingly, passengers continued to walk up the stopped escalator stairs, even past the open flame. And only minutes from disaster, no one seemed to realize the danger.
People were still buying tickets and selling tickets. There wasn't any real concern shown by anybody really passing through the ticket hall. And everybody else was just milling about, going back and forward through the ticket barriers. Nothing really going on.
At 7:33, Damon Brodie entered the ticket hall, oblivious to the fire.
Nobody stopped me or said anything, so I just wandered on through the ticket office and then down the Victoria Line escalators.
By the time Brodie reached the platform, London's fire brigade was on its way. At 7:43, 14 minutes after the fire was first spotted, firefighters entered King's Cross Station. Station officer Colin Townsley was in charge, a very experienced fireman. Halfway down the escalator, he saw the flames. No bigger than a campfire, barely a metre high and covering just a few steps. The situation seemed containable, but Townsley told his crew to put on their gear. He then sent his partner down another escalator to direct passengers away from the fire. He had no idea of the danger they were in. Townsley wasn't even wearing breathing apparatus.
I certainly wouldn't have taken breathing apparatus to investigate a fire, but at that time, it certainly didn't seem like a major fire. People were still coming out, people were still using the station as normal when he arrived.
The firemen couldn't see it, but the situation was far from normal. In less than 2 minutes, King's Cross would be engulfed in the worst fire in the history of the Underground, and 31 people would lose their lives. Rush hour at King's Cross Station, in the heart of the London Underground. A small fire burned on one of the escalators, but firemen thought they had it under control. Trains continued to stop at King's Cross, while passengers were slowly evacuated from the platforms by different routes.
Everybody just followed everybody else, and it was just, okay, inconvenient, but let's go and see what they want us for.
The detour led passengers to the main concourse. It seemed the safest place, but it was about to become a death trap.
As we got about halfway up the escalator, the voice of the person shouting became more and more intense and more panicked.
At the top of the escalator, fireman Colin Townsley saw something he thought impossible. Flames suddenly catapulted towards him, devouring 20 meters in a matter of seconds. Damon Brodie was in the middle of the ticket hall when the flame flew up the escalator and exploded into the concourse with the force of a jet engine.
From my right, this huge wall of fire. I mean, not flames, but literally dark red wall just moving around the ticket hall at high speed, and followed almost instantly by the thickest black smoke.
The smoke was so thick, Brodie couldn't even see that he was on fire, but he could feel the flames.
And I found myself rolling about on the floor to try to put these flames out.
The heat was scorching, jumping 20 degrees every second.
There was a great deal of screaming and shouting at the time, which within a few seconds just ended, and all that was left was just literally this roar.
The temperature inside the ticket hall reached upwards of 400 degrees Celsius in less than half a minute.
Every time I took any kind of breath in, it was scalding hot, scalding hot. And I had my hands up by my face as well to try to protect it from the heat, because it was just so hot.
Firefighters at street level were stunned to see dark clouds billowing from the station. The density of the smoke and the intensity of the fire made it impossible for them to follow their colleagues into the building.
There was a lot going on through your head at that point, and I thought, not this way. Nobody would find me there. It would, how would people know what happened? It was just not the right time to be dying.
Brodie tried to crawl out by himself. It was his only hope of survival. One of the first firefighters to arrive at King's Cross after the explosion was Mick Bell.
I just looked at the smoke and the thickness of it and knew you couldn't survive in that smoke without breathing apparatus. I sort of immediately presumed they were dead.
Most of those in the ticket hall were already dead, but not Brodie. He somehow managed to crawl 50 meters to safety.
As soon as I hit the fresh air, I felt excruciating pain everywhere. I mean, I screamed a lot. It was appalling, and I could see my hands were all crisped and there was skin effectively hanging off.
40% of Brodie's body was burned. He was one of only 6 to survive in the King's Cross ticket hall, and the last to get out alive. The tiny spark that had appeared to pose no threat had become a raging inferno that would take 30 fire crews to extinguish. The worst blaze in the history of the London Underground. Philip Squire had passed through King's Cross earlier that evening. Coming back, he was stunned by what he saw.
And so I just stood there, one of the crowd, thinking, what the hell happened here? There was a fireman sitting on the ground. I guess he'd been down there because he was soaking wet. And so I said to him, you know, how many people were killed? What happened? When did the bomb go off?
The scene was so horrific, Squire thought there must have been a terrorist attack.
And he looked at me and he just looked up and he said, it wasn't a bomb, it's a fire. And that was when I made the connection. This little thing I saw, which probably wasn't bigger than the size of my fist, that turned into that enormous fire. It's just beyond comprehension.
By 1 in the morning, the fire was pretty much out. The firefighters were exhausted, but the hard part was yet to come. Now the charred bodies would have to be recovered.
I didn't for one instant think that that number of people had died.
In the small hours of the morning, the death toll reached 31. Including one of their own, Station Officer Colin Townsley, killed in the line of duty.
I've heard that he was trying to shepherd people out, which, knowing Colin, I could well believe that.
A tragedy, and also a mystery. How did a small station fire grow and spread so quickly? The flames leaping so fast, those inside had no time or place to run. The morning after the fire, investigators began to hunt through the burned-out shell of King's Cross Station. They were under intense pressure to explain what had happened. The work of an arsonist, terrorist, or a tragic accident. What had fed the fire? There were concerns over the many layers of paint on the station's old walls, rumours of a blast of wind, and speculation about poor maintenance. All of Britain was waiting for answers. In the wake of the disaster, there was fear there'd be a similar tragedy in another public place. People across the huge city felt vulnerable. Nowhere was safe. Lives snuffed out in a moment as ordinary people went about their everyday business. Dave Halliday had been at the station just an hour before the fire.
I did wonder whether if I'd been delayed at work, things might have been very different.
The day after, Halliday had to go back, this time as one of the lead investigators.
As a forensic scientist, I have to put emotion aside when I'm actually working at a scene. I know that the event is very traumatic, but I feel that the best thing that I can do for these people is to do my job properly.
It was Halliday's job to determine what had started the blaze. The extraordinary speed and fury of the fire suggested it had help. Halliday first suspected arson.
Naturally, people tend to think if you have a very fast-developing fire without an apparent cause, that somehow the cause must be deliberate, that the fire must have been assisted in some way.
To move so quickly, the fire must have been fueled by an accelerant, something highly flammable like petrol or kerosene. Arson also fitted with Halliday's belief that the fire was not caused by electrical or mechanical failure.
Now, I gave this idea serious consideration because at the end of the day, I was positing that the fire had been started by a flame. And it's entirely possible that that flame could have been the result of a deliberate application rather than an accidental one.
Until they could rule out the possibility of arson, King's Cross would have to be treated as a crime scene. Investigators interviewed hundreds of people who'd passed through the station the night of the fire. 3 eyewitnesses reported seeing a man in blue overalls lurking around the escalator. One person even claimed to have seen him slip through a service door. But if it had been arson, the fire must have been set while the escalator was still moving.
Certainly from the lower machine room, it would be very, very difficult, if not dangerous, for a person to try and gain access to the point of origin.
The arson theory just didn't seem probable. The team was forced to rule it out. But they knew the fire had started under the escalator. Eyewitness Philip Squire had confirmed that. So that's where Halliday began his search, looking for anything that could hint at a cause. Then, the first solid clue. Strange burn marks on the skirting board along the underside of the escalator. Scars left by previous fires, some of them decades old.
There must be something that's causing fires under the escalator on a fairly regular basis. Now, if that is the case, then it would seem logical to assume that in this instance, the fire might have had the same cause.
Halliday was now looking for a single cause for multiple fires. How could a flame have come into contact with the skirting board not just once, but several times? Puzzled, Halliday looked for similar burn marks on the left side of the escalator. Nothing. Why would fires have developed only on the right side? Then it hit him. The fire had been man-made, but it wasn't arson. When Philip Squire had first smelled smoke, he'd assumed it was a cigarette. Smoking had been banned in the underground for 2 years before. But in 1987, it was still common for passengers to break the law and light up in the station.
And people would get off the train and light up straight away.
I mean, in my view, in any event, certainly at that time, a fairly lax attitude towards smoking on the underground. It wasn't necessarily taken very seriously.
A lot of smokers would reach the escalators and reach for their fags. By standing on the right-hand side, out of the way of the moving passengers, they could pause to light a cigarette. Halliday could just picture the scene. A cigarette is lit, but what happens to the match? Dropped, but still burning, a match would fall through the gap at the edge of the stair and land on the greased running track below. That's why Halliday found burn marks only on the right side of the escalator. Halliday was now convinced that a smoker's discarded match had started the fire. But what had fueled the flames? Industrial grease just doesn't catch fire so easily.
The components of the grease have ignition temperatures which are much higher than that which can be provided by a simple match. There's not enough heat in a match to get the grease going.
But when Halliday put a match to grease taken from the escalator track, it caught instantly.
What you need in order to burn something like grease, or indeed something analogous like, say, for instance, wax in a candle, you need a wick.
The King's Cross escalator hadn't been properly cleaned in 50 years. As a result, there were loads of flammable wicks trapped in the grease.
Fluff from clothing, skin debris. We shed a lot of skin, dry skin from ourselves as we walk around. Hairs, all of those things can provide viable wicks, thus allowing the grease to burn.
To test the theory, investigators dropped a lit match onto the greased track. 1 in every 4 started a fire. The burn marks Halliday had found proved there'd been many fires over the years. Most had gone undetected. A few had been put out by underground staff, and occasionally someone had called the fire brigade. But never had any of those fires erupted into a deadly inferno. So what was different about the King's Cross fire? To a veteran firefighter, it had looked routine. Yet in less than 2 minutes, it had burst out of control. The only clues investigators had to go on were hidden in the mysterious burn patterns. Why was the ceiling directly above the fire not burned? Flames and hot gases are supposed to rise, and so the worst damage should have been here, where the fire had started and burned the longest. But it wasn't. The real destruction was in the ticket hall at the top of the escalator, more than 20 meters away. Here, the heat had been so intense that cement walls had cracked and lights melted. This is where most of the victims died. The easiest part of the puzzle had been solved. Investigators were sure the fire had been started by a smoker's match. But how had it exploded out of control so quickly? Could the freakish behavior of the King's Cross fire be linked to the station itself? Death by design. It was up to Britain's Health and Safety Executive to explain what had happened. But Keith Moody, head of the Fire and Explosives Division, had never seen a fire quite like this. Flames and hot gases are supposed to go up. The burn patterns at King's Cross, though, clearly showed the fire had defied the rules.
We might have expected the fire to have risen up to the ceiling very early on. Pattern of damage didn't seem to suggest that was the case, and the main reason for saying that was the extensive burning on the number 4 escalator.
Most of the wooden escalator was completely torched, but the ceiling above it was relatively undamaged. If the fire didn't spread up, where did it go? Or had it begun as a normal fire and then suddenly changed direction? Although a risky endeavour, there was only one way for investigators to find out. They had to go back to King's Cross, to the same escalator, and once again, set it on fire. The 18th of November, 1987. A devastating fire struck the heart of the London Underground. 31 people lost their lives. 2 weeks later, investigators went back to King's Cross to court disaster again. On the same escalator, they deliberately set another fire. The first lit match they dropped through the gap at the side of the escalator continued to burn.
Yeah, the grease is beginning to drip. I can actually hear the flames now.
Within 2 or 3 minutes, it had spread about 1 metre along the running channel, and it was travelling up that grease and garbage.
Within 5 minutes, the flames were big enough to take hold of the escalator. The wooden skirting boards directly above the fire started to burn.
Yeah, we got flames well up above the top of the skirting.
And once they were involved, the flames spread up them and through onto the passenger side of the escalator.
Just 7 minutes after the match was dropped, investigators saw flames on the top of the escalator steps. But by then, the fire underneath was spreading fast and they were forced to put it out.
The skirting board is delaminating.
The experiment left investigators puzzled. This fire seemed to have behaved normally, spreading upwards at a predictable rate. So why did the deadly fire jump from manageable flames on the escalator to an explosion in the ticket hall in just a matter of seconds. Those that were caught in its path hadn't even time to run.
It was just so fast and just so extraordinary. I can't imagine many people have ever seen it, and God forbid anybody else would ever want to see it again. But it was so fast.
The speed suggested some sort of accelerant had quickened the fire's spread. Investigators had already ruled out arson, so the substance they were looking for had to be part of the shaft structure. One clear sign of rapid fire spread is delaminated paint. The sheets hanging from the shaft ceiling were proof that the fire had spread at an extraordinary rate. But could paint have been the accelerant? When paint peels, it becomes the perfect fuel for fire.
Because of that delamination, what you're getting is paint burning on both sides. If you were to hold up a sheet of paper and apply a match to the bottom, everyone knows that this will immediately ignite and flame will spread very rapidly up that piece of paper.
For paint to peel in a fire, two things are necessary: multiple layers and poor adhesion. King's Cross had both. 12 layers of paint were found on the escalator shaft, the base coat dating back to the Second World War. And the constant flow of traffic through King's Cross made it inevitable that layers would peel.
Where there is a lot of people, there is a build-up of grime on the surface from people smoking and things like that, oils and tars. These find their way into layers and as such could cause intercoat adhesion to break down in the event of fire.
If the paint had peeled off in large sheets, it could explain why the fire spread so rapidly. Investigators started to think that the King's Cross fire was not a freak of nature, but rather a textbook case. The flames and hot air had travelled up to the ceiling, causing the paint to peel. With a ready fuel, the fire had rocketed up the shaft and into the ticket hall. Burn patterns seemed to support the paint theory. There was a clear path of destruction along the ceiling. Investigators attempted to recreate the rapid fire spread using paint as the accelerant. At first, the fire did spread quickly, using the layers of paint as fuel. But after a few meters, it stalled and then stopped growing. A far cry from what eyewitnesses had seen during the King's Cross fire.
What was reported by eyewitnesses was more the effect of a fireball and not the burning of all the surfaces.
Few saw the jet flame that night and lived to talk about it. But Damon Brodie did.
I can say with hand on heart that what was alight at that point was the air. It's not like it clung to the roof or it clung to the, it was a wall.
Paint could not have caused such a massive explosion. So how did the air in the ticket hall suddenly explode into flames? Investigators have a name for the phenomenon. It's called flashover. It's the most deadly stage of a fire. It happens when flames have devoured most of the oxygen, leaving behind only hot gases on the verge of ignition. At the point of flashover, the buildup of heat is so intense that spontaneous combustion is unavoidable. But flashover can only happen in a confined space, and King's Cross didn't fit the bill. The escalator shaft was open at both ends, and the constant supply of fresh air should have prevented any buildup of hot gases. But the very intelligence that ruled out flashover sent investigators in a new direction. Perhaps the steady supply of oxygen had fanned the flames, turning a small fire into a raging inferno. Underground rail systems are essentially wind tunnels. Trains push and suck air through stations. It's a phenomenon known as the piston effect. In a station as busy as King's Cross, trains are constantly coming and going along 5 lines, forcing air through a complex maze of tunnels and passageways. Mick Bell remembers feeling the piston effect on the night of the King's Cross fire.
Couldn't really see where they were going, and all of a sudden it would just clear. They'd be able to see everything within the complex for a few seconds, and it'd all come back down. We certainly believed that was the effect of the trains forcing the air.
Had a sudden blast of air from incoming trains fanned the flames, causing the fire to explode.
A number of trains had come into King's Cross Station just about the time the fire was starting. There was potential there for these ventilation flows to drive the fire forward.
According to the theory, an unlucky combination of trains coming and going had created such an airflow and caused a small fire to grow deadly. To find out, investigators measured the airflow in King's Cross between 7:30 and 8 in the evening, the approximate time of the fire. At 7:41, 4 minutes before the fire had exploded, air was blowing down the shaft in a steady stream. It's the same wind conditions that station officer Colin Townsley must have encountered when he'd arrived at King's Cross. But 2 minutes later, a westbound train entered the station. The air suddenly reversed direction and began blowing up the escalator shaft. On the night of the terrible blaze, wind was now being funneled up over the flames. 1 minute later, Townsley had been enveloped by a spontaneous burst of fire. Had the sudden reversal in airflow moving up the shaft been enough to cause the fire to explode?
The velocities that we observed would only provide a very small tilt to those flames.
Tube trains don't generate enough wind to create the kind of fireball that swept through King's Cross Station. The piston effect was struck from the list of suspects. Investigators were back at square one. After months of work, they were certain of just one thing. The fire had been ignited by a smoker's match. But they still didn't know what had caused the flames to spread with such extraordinary speed. Chief Investigator Keith Moody was desperate. He turned to a computer lab in Oxfordshire for help. Using cutting-edge technology, it's possible to model the relationship between heat and airflow. Key to the development of any fire, because heat affects airflow, and airflow feeds a fire.
They felt confident that they could set up the geometry and then model what would happen when you had a heat source in that escalator and you had air flowing through the system.
The lab typically uses its software to model complicated designs, like plans for nuclear reactors. But could they solve the puzzle of the King's Cross fire? For nearly 2 months, Suzanne Simcox had been trying to replicate the King's Cross disaster inside her computer.
If you think of a chimney, when you have a fire at the bottom of a chimney, the hot air's rising and it's drawing cold air in from below. What we've got here is like a chimney on a slant. So the shaft is like a slanted chimney. We've got a fire halfway up the chimney, and it's going to be sucking cold air in from the bottom of the shaft. And the question was, what does that airflow, that draft of air, do to the fire? Or does it do something else that explains the very fast spread of the fire?
Tracking airflow through King's Cross was a challenge. The station is a structural oddity, a mass of irregular shapes and sizes, more complicated than even a nuclear reactor. To create a virtual fire, Simcox needed an accurate 3D model of King's Cross. For reliable results, the dimensions would have to be exact. What she found was astonishing. The virtual fire seemed to defy the laws of physics, just as the real fire did. The computer revealed hot air resting in the escalator trench, not rising as it should have done.
What we found was that rather than the hot air rising to the ceiling, which you might expect, that in fact the highest temperatures were down in the escalator trench.
Had they finally found the reason for the fire's rapid spread? If the hot gases had collected in the escalator trench, the entire wooden structure would have been heated to the point of spontaneous combustion. But the results didn't add up. Hot air is always supposed to rise.
Our reaction was the same as theirs initially, which was, have you got it right?
The biggest skeptics of all were ourselves. We just did not trust them. You can never trust computer models. We were always in the back of our mind is we could be making a mistake and we need independent corroboration.
The scientists at the lab had come up with a rationale to explain why this hot air was failing to rise.
And so I was thinking, looking around for explanations, can we see something in other books, in other journals that corroborate what we've seen?
We tried to understand what was happening physically and came up with the concept of the Coanda effect.
The Coanda effect, a scientific principle that states that liquid or gas will tend to cling to an inclined surface. In the case of King's Cross, it meant the hot gases from the fire may not have risen to the ceiling and dispersed. Instead, they'd be trapped in the trench formed by the steps and sides of the escalator. And once trapped, they would have superheated the wood. By the time Station Officer Townsley had seen the fire, the entire escalator was on the brink of explosion. If the theory was correct, investigators might have finally solved the mystery of the King's Cross disaster. But computer models can't be relied on for the whole story. There was only one way to find out if that's really what happened. Investigators decided to reproduce the computer-simulated fire in the real world. The idea was simple. Build a 1/3 scale model of the King's Cross escalator, set it on fire, and watch how it burned. The test itself wouldn't take long, but the preparation was tedious. The scale model had to be an exact replica of the real thing. It took dozens of builders working around the clock for a full month to put it together. Video cameras were set to record the temperature and the speed of the fire. Investigators hoped the test would finally prove that King's Cross was no ordinary blaze. If they were right, they'd be shedding light on a fire risk endangering the lives of millions of passengers every day. After 8 months of intense investigation, forensic scientists thought they'd finally solved the mystery of the King's Cross fire. They were hoping an elaborate model could help them prove how 31 people had perished in the London Underground, victims of a sudden burst of flame. Peeling paint and the effects of wind had both been ruled out. But with a fire of such magnitude, some outside agent must have played a role. Investigators' next guess was that hot gases from the fire had clung to the steps and sides of the escalator, creeping along the incline instead of burning upwards.
Start the countdown, over. Standing by.
To test the theory, they started an experiment using the same trigger that had ignited the King's Cross fire.
Okay, countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
At the edge of the model escalator, investigators dropped a lit match. When Damon Brodie had first entered the King's Cross ticket hall, the real fire was just starting to creep across the stairs. But underneath the escalator, it had already grown so big that underground staff couldn't control it. Investigators watched as flames filled the width of their escalator trench. This is the point at which Station Officer Townsley had first seen the real fire, 2 minutes before the firestorm erupted. Attempts to clear the station had been confused. There was no evacuation plan, and trains kept arriving. After waiting several minutes on the platform, Brodie had been directed up to the ticket hall. Up to this point, the experiment revealed nothing unusual. Flames were burning up. The Coanda effect, the tendency for liquid or gas to cling to an inclined surface, had not yet taken hold.
I was looking at the flames and thinking, they're not going to lie down. And then they suddenly just went over.
As soon as the flames flattened, they began to superheat the steps. Instead of rising, the hot gases from the fire started filling the escalator trench. Sensors in the station recorded temperatures above 800 degrees Celsius. Just below Townsley, 2 tons of wood in the escalator was ready to explode.
Someone who was standing at the top of the trench said, "It's happening just like Howell said it would."
Then it happened very rapidly, that the flames then spread straight up the escalator trench.
At the same time, Brodie and other passengers were going up a nearby escalator. They were being evacuated from the ticket hall just as it had begun to fill with fire. Investigators estimated the explosion was the equivalent to the engine blast from a jumbo jet on takeoff. Brodie was caught in the flames.
For that situation to have occurred at all is kind of hard to swallow, really, because that's how a lot of people came to find themselves being in the ticket hall at that point.
The King's Cross fire claimed 31 lives.
Tunnels and shafts where
The test fire left behind the same signature burn pattern. Investigators had finally pieced together the puzzle of the King's Cross fire. Flames and hot gases clung to the wooden stairs while the escalator shaft acted as a chimney. That superheated the wooden steps and sides of the escalator, triggering the devastating firestorm. Investigators name their discovery the trench effect.
Because of King's Cross, the fire science community have learnt their lessons. They know now the type of rules to apply, the type of problems which can occur when you have shafts at different angles.
As a result of the investigation into the King's Cross disaster, the London Underground adopted 146 safety recommendations. All escalators are now metal and have smoke detectors and automatic sprinklers. They are regularly cleaned and inspected. The smoking ban is strictly enforced. And the Underground now has a clear evacuation plan.
I'll travel the Underground again, but I'm much more aware of my kind of self-management. I want to exit out of this station. What are the ways in which, I will be able to look after myself?
Since the disaster at King's Cross, architects and engineers around the world have learned of the trench effect. The angles, lengths and widths of shafts, and even stairwells are carefully considered in new designs, so that the tragedy of King's Cross will never be repeated.